Good morning. Good morning. My name is Alan Madden, Gadigal Elder. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for my first song, born and bred in Redfern, capital of Sydney. Aboriginal, black, Redfern, follow Manly. Nah, not true. Rabbitohs. Welcome to country to me is always an honour and a pleasure. Just to give you a little bit of an insight of where you are and who we are. Welcome to Gadigal country. Welcome to Gadigal land. As with all welcomes, firstly I'd like to acknowledge our First Nations and traditional owners of the lands that you may have come from or work upon, and pay my respects. To all our Aboriginal elders, all elders, past and present, also pay my respects. To all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters, from whatever Aboriginal or island nation you may have come from, welcome to Gadigal. And to all our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters here today, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. No matter where you've come from, whether it be across the seas, across the state, or across town, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. And as I've mentioned many times before, was, is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Only three things short than that: coming, taxation and going. It's an honour and a pleasure to be here today to welcome one and all to Gadigal. Gadigal is one of 29 clans of the Eora Nation. The Eora Nation is bounded by nature's own, the Hawkesbury River to the north, the Pean to the west, and Georges River to the south. And in between those three mighty rivers is the Eora Nation. And in that nation there are 29 clans. And the clan's land we're on today is Gadigal. On behalf of members of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, once again, a very warm and sincere welcome to you to Gadigal. There's an old Aboriginal saying out there, and I think it's very appropriate for you mob here today. They say, where there's a will, there's relatives. And as you travel across these traditional lands and waters, may the spirits of our ancestors guide, look over you, and keep you safe. So once again, on behalf of the Land Council and of the Gadigal mob, welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Alan, for that wonderful welcome to country. And I start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to First Nations people who are with us today watching us online. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the ceremonial closing of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. My name's Peter Overton. I'm your host for this event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and thanking serving and ex-serving members of the Australian Defence Force and their families for the unique and important sacrifices they have made on behalf of our country. I'd also like to acknowledge the dignitaries in the room who've joined us this morning. The Honourable Matt Keogh MP, the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel, the Honourable David Harris MP, New South Wales Minister for Veterans Affairs, Senator Jacqui Lambie, Senator for Tasmania, Admiral David Johnston, the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, Warrant Officer Ken Robertson, Senior Enlisted Advisor to the Chief of Defence, Air Marshal Robert Chipman, Vice Chief of Defence Force, Vice Admiral Mark Hammond, Chief of Navy, Lieutenant General Simon Stewart, Chief of Army, Air Marshal Stephen Chappell, Chief of Air Force, Ms Alison Frame, Secretary of the Commonwealth Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr Simon Newham, Deputy Secretary, Integrity and International Group, Attorney General's Department. I'm joined on stage this morning by three very important people. Mr Nick Caldis, Chair of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide, and his fellow commissioners, Dr Peggy Brown and the Honourable James Douglas. I'd also like to recognise the people in this room who have contributed to this landmark inquiry by sharing their stories of lived experience through public hearings, private submissions and private hearings. It's fair to say that without you, this Royal Commission would not have been possible. Some housekeeping. Today's formalities will run until about 12:45 p.m. There'll be no breaks. We ask if you need to leave, do it quietly, but please, we'd like you to stay and remain seated. Today's event is being live streamed. There's also media in attendance. You may be filmed, you may appear on the live stream, just to make you aware of that. If you don't want to be photographed today, please let our Royal Commission staff know. And light refreshments will be served outside at the conclusion of today's events. It is important to note that some in the audience or watching online might find what is discussed today distressing. If at any stage you need support, the Royal Commission counselling team is on hand with us to help as required. If you're watching online, there is contact information on your screen. Please make sure your mobile phones are switched off or on silent. And now, if you please, stand if you're able to for the National Anthem. Please be seated. The Royal Commission's final report, to be handed to the Governor-General on the 9th of September, will comprise robust, evidence-based findings and recommendations for government to address the national tragedy of defence and veteran suicide. It will be the culmination of an exhaustive 3-year inquiry that has kept those with lived experience of military suicide and suicidality at its heart. It's been their deeply personal, often harrowing stories that have shone a bright light in dark places and across the veteran ecosystem. It's important to recognise that this work would not have been possible without the contribution of expert witnesses, stakeholders and members of the defence and veteran community who've supported the Royal Commission as it has travelled around the country. Let's look back now on the journey of the Royal Commission into defence and veteran suicide.
Hello, I'm Nick Caldis. The Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide was established in July 2021 after then Prime Minister Morrison bowed to mounting political pressure following a hard-fought and sustained campaign by the brave families of Australian veterans who had taken their own lives. Every death by suicide is tragic. For every life lost, there are family, friends, colleagues and whole communities flooded by grief and anger. And there is an over-representation of defence and veteran deaths by suicide in this country. The numbers are heartbreaking. At least 1,677 of Australia's finest were lost to suicide between 1997 to 2021. However, we estimate the true number of preventable deaths to be upwards of 3,000. And the needless loss of life continues today. On average, there have been 3 deaths by suicide each fortnight over the past decade. Over the last 3 years, this Royal Commission has left no stone unturned as we've examined the cultural and systemic issues contributing to this national tragedy. It's been a complex task in a complex environment dealing with a complex issue, but one we've been incredibly privileged to undertake. We've held 12 public hearings comprising 346 witnesses. We have issued compulsory notices and received more than 3 million pages of information in response. We've hosted close to 900 private sessions or private hearings. We've received almost 5,900 submissions, and we have visited Navy, Army and Air Force bases nationwide to hear firsthand from our service personnel about the opportunities and challenges of life in our military. As we prepare to hand down our final report, we're buoyed by the government's response to our interim report, overhauling the complex legislation governing veterans' entitlements and resourcing to the Department of Veteran Affairs to clear the backlog of unallocated claims. The voice of lived experience has been at the heart of this commission. It's been the deeply personal, often harrowing experiences shared in submissions, private sessions and at public hearings that have shone a bright light in dark places. We've been inspired by the tremendous strength and resilience, knowledge and resourcefulness of those within the defence and veteran community who have contributed to our important work. Let's look back now at some of the key moments from this landmark inquiry.
5 mothers whose sons took their own lives after leaving the Australian Defence Force have shared their heartbreaking stories at New South Wales Parliament. They're calling for a Royal Commission into the suicide of veterans.
We just go through day by day trying to get something done about it and trying just to cope on our own.
From the moment that my son passed away, I realised that I was not going to get any respect from the ADF for my son.
My son was still serving, recognised that his mental health was spiralling.
We are all here being the voices of our sons because they're not here.
He was born on Armistice Day. How ironic to die on Anzac Day. It wasn't a coincidence. Brad chose that day to prove a point.
Anthony Albanese has declared the issue of veteran suicides a crisis.
There are too many kids who've lost their mum and dad. Too many mum and dads who've lost their sons and daughters.
Parliament has united to try and force the Prime Minister to establish a Royal Commission.
MPs and senators combined to push the government towards a Royal Commission into veteran suicides against its preferred path of a permanent independent commissioner.
And the black hole in my heart for my 10 mates that have died.
I think there is a perception in the community and that a Royal Commission provides that acknowledgement that I think families are seeking, and I acknowledge that. And secondly, I provide that process, I think, for healing.
I would love to show that we saved one life.
Her petition for a Royal Commission with 400,000 signatures paying off.
There's some breaking news now. It's understood the Prime Minister will today announce a Royal Commission into veteran suicide.
It'll examine all aspects of service in the Australian Defence Force.
This inquiry has been a long time coming, hasn't it?
Good morning, Carl. Yeah, it follows a long fight by former soldiers and families of veterans who have taken their own lives.
The struggles of military members who took their own lives will finally be told by their families at a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicides.
The Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide is now in session. Please be seated.
Ours is an important task to make a difference to the lives of Defence members and veterans. They are those of us who willingly choose to pursue the mission of the Australian Defence Force, quote, to defend Australia and its national interests in order to advance Australia's security and prosperity.
We're here to learn how and what to do better so that for others facing similar circumstances, death by suicide is not the outcome.
To those affected by suicide, and on behalf of the Royal Commission, I make this promise.
We will listen with empathy. We will act with compassion and without fear or favour. And we will learn from your stories in order to make a real difference to the lives of serving and former personnel and their families.
They've worn the uniform. They've done everything we've asked them to do. They've put their life on the line.
This is a wonderful opportunity to try to do something for the ex-diggers.
It's a very big, complex issue that we're exploring.
The ex-cop, the judge and the psychiatrist. The staggering rate of defence suicides has them shocked.
There's been 57 inquiries, more than 700 recommendations, and witness after witness telling the Royal Commission the government and defence have been aware of systemic issues for years.
Private Daniel Garforth, 21, his mother's boy and a father too.
Most of us will be looking forward, to Christmas and events. We don't get to do that anymore. That's all right.
I believe that his PTSD got to a stage where he didn't believe he had an option, that he was in a constant state of suffering.
Terry did not sign up to be abused by her peers and her higher-ups. She did not sign up to be neglected, bullied, ostracised, threatened, physically assaulted, sexually assaulted, or emotionally assaulted. She never saw combat and she was never deployed, yet she still suffered PTSD from the abuse and the culture within the Defence Force.
Where am I at? It's medical negligence, loss of my career, loss of my identity, false timelines created about me that I can prove. But what do I want? I don't want this to happen to anyone else. This has to stop. This is simply leadership. That is all it is.
There's this great tagline they've been using: you enlist the veteran, you keep the family. Show me. Show me you mean that.
To have issues that start in defence through DVA and then into the ESO, it's just abhorrent to have so many people hurting so much and have nowhere to turn, or the places that we turn to do more damage. It's disgusting.
Nobody in defence, in DVA, at a government level, and a lot of the larger ESOs, nobody is doing their best.
To my youngest son, I know you've paid a very, very heavy price for what you had to do to care for me over that period of time. And I know you are still paying the price of that. I thank you sincerely.
2017 is 4.5 years ago, but it's just like yesterday.
Their strength, unimaginable. Words, powerful.
I think we've heard far too many stories from parents who've lost children in the prime of their life, in deaths that should be preventable.
Can I ask you, what would you say to your kids if they wanted to join the Defence Forces now, based on what you've heard?
I don't think I'd oppose my kids joining the military, but I would be urging caution and I'd be giving them a hell of a lot of advice.
And what would that advice be?
To be careful how they interact with people, to be brave and report things that may have run off the rails, not to let them slide, and to have courage to come forward and speak up when things are not right.
It's been those with lived experience of suicide and suicidal behaviour who have bravely come forward and shared their stories with us at public hearings, in private sessions and through written submissions. It is they who have enabled us to shine a bright light on the many complex cultural and systemic issues that are failing serving and ex-serving ADF members and their families. To them, on behalf of the nation, we say thank you, we see you, we hear you, and we salute you.
The Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide has handed down a shocking report describing the despair of our service personnel as a national tragedy. Urgent recommendations have been made in order to save more lives.
Governor-General David Hurley takes possession of some confronting reading.
The rate of veteran suicide in Australia is a national tragedy.
One Royal Commissioner Nick Caldis's draft report says is made worse by a bureaucratic system failing veterans and their families.
13 recommendations contained in the report are detailed, direct and offer concrete solutions.
The first step to fixing a problem is to acknowledge that a problem exists.
I'm aware that there are a lot of veterans out there in the community who still feel a lot of anger and have a lot of distress.
My message to them would be that I would acknowledge their experience and the impact on them of suboptimal practices in the past, and I would want to acknowledge that hurt and distress and apologise for that.
That we recognise that there is a service nexus now, and that is clear to us between an individual's experience and their welfare, both in the service and outside of the service. So we're acknowledging that people have experienced suicidality and died by suicide as a result of their service in the Royal Australian Air Force, and I want to offer an unreserved apology on behalf of the Royal Australian Air Force to them.
We do place our people in challenging, risky and sometimes harrowing environments, and it leaves a mark. We do a good job of trying to rehabilitate physical injuries. We've got to find a better pathway to rehabilitate and manage mental health injury.
As the Chief of the Australian Army, past and present, I offer an unreserved and sincere apology to everyone whom we have failed.
Thank you.
I haven't finished, Commissioner.
Take your time.
I want to thank you for your service and to let you know that your courage will make a difference.
Our people deserve and should rightly expect the wellbeing, support and care they need, both during and after their service. I acknowledge that this has not always been the case and has tragically led to the deaths by suicide of some of our people. I apologise unreservedly for these deficiencies.
But what is actually going to matter is what you recommend and what we ultimately implement. History will be our judge, and I just want the families to know that we are deeply mindful that in all that we do, we will not be able to escape the judgment of history, and we are utterly focused on making sure that this, your work and our response to it results in meaningful change.
How many Defence members and veterans need to kill themselves? This Royal Commission is the line in the sand. Which side of history will our senior leaders be on? We are watching.
Australia has let down its veterans and their families for far too long. Far too many lives have already been lost. As I said at the National Press Club last year, no longer can we allow the preventable deaths of our finest to occur. History will indeed judge those who are in a position to make a difference, and service members, veterans, their families and the future workforce of the ADF will be watching.
Commissioners Dr Peggy Brown, Mr Nick Caldis and the Honourable James Douglas. Nick, I'll start with you. Very powerful, I can see. You've lived this for a number of years now. Even now, it's still affecting you very deeply, isn't it? The brave, courageous people that came forward and shared their stories. How critical was that courage of our Defence Force men and women to stand in front of you?
It is absolutely critical. We've said many times, we could not have done anything without those who had the lived experience, who went through these issues. If they didn't come forward and tell us what happened, and so many of them did that simply because they didn't want it to happen to anyone else. Reliving trauma is not easy. We appreciate that. people who have been the victims of sexual abuse and other really traumatic attacks, raised their hand, made written submissions, spoke to us in private sessions and gave evidence in public. And for that, we are really grateful. It's absolutely crucial. We could not have done it without them.
James, the Royal Commission is due to hand down its final report to the Governor-General on September 9. What do you hope to see happen in the immediate future?
We hope to see that it's tabled speedily and starts prompting informed debate amongst the community and the political community and the defence community about what needs to be done. We, of course, in the report have made recommendations, but the report needs to be read carefully generally too, because apart from the recommendations, there are many discussions of things of significant interest. And I would like to see that sort of debate kick off early and influence what the government does about our recommendations. And one recommendation, which we've already made in our interim report, is that there be a permanent body to follow on from us.
How... I'll come back to you, James. Peggy, given all the previous inquiries and hundreds of recommendations that largely have been ignored by those in positions of power, what can you do as commissioners to make sure the important work of this Royal Commission and its recommendations are actually taken on board and acted on by government?
Peter, I think that in large part it's what we've done to date. We have tried very hard to engage widely, to be very open and transparent in what we're doing, and to, not only hear the voices of those with lived experience, but to, engage with people in defence, people in DVA, people in government, to ensure that they too are hearing the voices. So, and I think we've also tried within the report to very clearly set out what we've heard, the evidence that we've heard, to clearly set out what the issues are, what the problem is, and then also to set out clearly what we think are some of the pathways forward and the recommendations that we can make. So, as I say, largely it's what we've done to date. I think going forward, we want people to engage with our report and, as James said, to consider it deeply, not just look at the recommendations, but to actually consider everything that's in that report and to get behind it and continue to follow the outcomes of this Royal Commission until we see change.
Well, touching on what James said, James, how important is an oversight body to monitor the implementation and success of the Royal Commission's not only recommendations, but the great body of work that you put together, and to maintain a keen focus on these issues heading into the future?
I think it's terribly important, as Nick has said many times in the past. There have been many inquiries and recommendations before us, and nonetheless the rate of suicide hasn't changed significantly. What we think a permanent body will serve will be to not only monitor the implementation of our recommendations, but also to keep a close eye on the problem as a whole, because it's a problem which can change shape and assume forms that may not have been as relevant in the last few years, but may become more relevant in the future. One issue that's been canvassed in the press recently is about traumatic brain injury. Now, we've had evidence about that, but that's an area of continuing inquiry, and it may well cast different light on the issues we've examined into the future. So that's why we think a permanent body is very significant, and one which will keep the focus going, because there's a real risk that the focus will move off this issue if there isn't some permanent body looking at it. And before we existed, there was a proposed national commission which didn't attract the full support of Parliament at the time, led by Brigadier Bernadette Boss. So we think it's significant that something follow us, and much sooner rather than later.
Nick, do you have a confidence about that a body can be established, will be supported by government to maintain the momentum in this space?
I think we're all cautiously optimistic. I think one thing the Commission has done is it highlighted all the problems quite clearly. They're at a point now where they're undeniable, and hopefully that would lead governments. And we do hope that all of these problems are tackled in a bipartisan way. They shouldn't be political. Looking after our veterans has to be a priority, whether you're on one side of politics or the other. I would hope that the other thing we've done is, having identified the 57 at least previous inquiries, 700 and something recommendations, it's pretty clear you can't keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting the result to come out different. We have to do something different, and we've looked at all sorts of options. The only way that we think someone can monitor this and report on it publicly and loudly is to have an entity that acts independently and does that. There are examples. In the US, they have a panel of experts that reports annually to Congress. There's an act of Congress that governs that, and the report can't be delayed or stopped. We're not seeking that sort of draconian measure, but certainly having a dedicated body such as the Interim Commissioner that was established under Dr. Bernadette Boss was doing very good work. It didn't have the support of Parliament. It didn't get through there. But my fear, and we'll say it again shortly, is at least that body existed. It had a few issues, a few bits to iron out, but it existed and it was doing well. If it's not established, we're actually going to leave everyone in a worse place than when we found them. There was something there before. There isn't at the moment once we shut down.
Once you shut down, will you continue to make noise in the background and come to the front if you have to?
We hope we don't need to.
Diplomatic. Peggy, it's commonly said that suicide prevention is everyone's business. What role do everyday Australians have in preventing defence and veteran suicide?
Peter, I think they have a number of roles. Firstly, just following on from what Nick was saying, I think we need all Australians to be aware of this issue and to care about it, and to let their local member know that they care about it, and to watch and see how government responds, how Defence, DVA, the state and territory governments respond, and to speak up if they don't think that enough is being done. But apart from that, in everyday life, they will see Defence members and their families, they will see veterans and their families, and they can be warm and welcoming and engaging and inviting and supporting veterans and their families, Defence members and their families. You know, Defence members post regularly. Their families have to change location, they change schools, they change friendship groups. There's great opportunities there for them to actually assist those families and service personnel to integrate into their communities and to become, appreciated, I guess, in a new location, be that every couple of years or whatever. So there's lots of ways in which Australians, every Australian, can support our Defence Force members and our veterans and their families.
Last word, Nick, from you.
We just want to thank everyone who's contributed, who's come forward, who's given their time, who's helped us to understand what the problems are and to articulate the solutions, hopefully paint the way forward. We are heartened, and I'll say a bit more shortly, about the quick response from the government in accepting the recommendations that actually matter. There were a couple of recommendations that related to procedural issues, and if anything was going to get held up, I'm glad it was them, not the actual the meaty ones, if you like, that actually solve problems for veterans. We're very grateful that was dealt with very quickly, and the resourcing of DVA has been increased and the legislation is being harmonised. All of those things are going on, very much a work in progress, but I think we've all got to be aware, if it's the final message is, no one should take their foot off the pedal. This work is not done.
Nick Cowdes, Peggy Brown, James Douglas, our commissioners, thank you. We'll hear more from you a little later, would you please? Thank our commissioners.
My husband died by suicide in 2017, and from the week after his death, I was on a mission to help make defence and the support system better for families.
How the ADF treated me when I sought out an explanation into my brother's suicide and resulting in losing my career. As emotional as this journey has been, the support from the Royal Commission and those people that have also had issues with the ADF in the past has been tremendous. And while it's very painful to lose your identity, the career you love, I couldn't be culpable or responsible for the next suicide if I hadn't spoken up.
When he died, I thought I was unique, but I was one of thousands.
I actually worked with Dave Finney, which is obviously the person, the sailor that started, I guess, that really catapulted this drive for a Royal Commission. And I held a service for him here in Sydney. And unfortunately in that week I lost 3 friends within the service to suicide. So I was like, right, this just has to stop. We can't keep doing it the way that we are.
The issues that the Royal Commission was investigating are not new. They are decades old, and it was really important for us to amplify the voices of the families that fought for this commission.
We're really pushing to make sure that the ex-service community work together to make sure we capture any person in need and no one slips through the cracks. We have to work together to use our position and bargaining power to press the government to implement the changes that are required.
I wanted to be able to tell Paul's story. I wanted to explain that he was an amazingly talented young man, and Paul's death, I believe, was directly attributable to the unacceptable behaviour and bullying that he received during his military career.
I wanted to help give a voice for those who couldn't speak, and I hope that nobody has to go through the same things that many of us have gone through.
As difficult as it was for me to tell my story, I needed to tell my story to make sure that it never happens again, ever.
In June this year, the Royal Commission sought to honour the contribution of those with lived experience of military suicide and suicidality through the publication of a book, Shining a Light, Stories of Trauma and Tragedy, Hope and Healing. Written by author and filmmaker Patrick Lindsay AM, this trauma-informed book tells the stories of people's lived experience of service. To tell us more about his experience in writing this very special book, would you please welcome to the stage Patrick Lindsay.
Thanks, Pete. Pretty emotional morning. Commissioners, honoured guests, veterans and their loved ones, ladies and gentlemen, a special shout out to Uncle Alan Madden and to James Williams, our Dig player, who was a veteran and served with 8-9 Battalion. I was truly honoured to be chosen to write Shining a Light. I knew it would be a great privilege and I saw it as a sacred duty. It turned out to be the toughest and most important assignment I've ever undertaken. I was tasked by Dr. Peggy Brown on behalf of the Commissioners with illustrating the deeply personal lived experience stories that have been revealed to the Commission. Reading through those submissions, and many of them are really harrowing, has been a life-changing journey. They referred to things like bullying, hazing, harassment, substance abuse, in-service violence, extreme training, sexual harassment, and a hyper-masculine culture that discouraged help-seeking and even stigmatised those with physical or mental health problems. Some of the submissions highlighted a leadership and/or a chain of command that perpetuated or inflamed many of those issues by normalising abuse or silencing or covering up complaints. Some believed that elements of defence culture actually contributed to veteran suicide and suicidality. And as a result, some victims and witnesses simply internalised the impact of those issues at great personal cost. So the aim of our book was to create a record, a snapshot, if you like, in their own words, of the damage done to veterans and their loved ones by failures that have contributed to the appallingly high rates of suicide and suicidality amongst our veterans. Roughly half of the 6,000 odd written submissions made to the Commission came from those with lived experience. That's a massive reservoir of material to digest. And I had about 6 months to actually write the book. There's simply no way I could have done justice to the courage and resilience of the individuals behind those submissions without the help of the extraordinary teams working feverishly behind the scenes at the Commission, many of them over more than 3 years. So my sincere thanks go to the Commissioners, who are remarkable people, to CEO Tracy Bell, Assistant Secretary Bridie O'Sullivan, who shepherded me through the whole process, Michelle Howe, to Dr. Dave Levy and his team of really extraordinary researchers, and the other superb teams, the Counselling and Inquiries team, the editorial team, the Council assisting the Commission, private sessions team, media and communications, and stakeholder engagement team, and to Anna Herod, our graphic designer, for her beautiful work in the publication. I have to say that as I got to know these teams and the people involved, the commissioners themselves over the past year, I've been really greatly impressed at their calibre, their passion, which I think you saw today, and their devotion to their work. In a world where you hear so many complaints about falling standards, incompetence, ethical decline, and lack of care, you guys stand out like a beacon. You should be genuinely proud of your work. It's a once-in-a-lifetime contribution to making Australia a better nation. Sorry, I heard all those videos beforehand. It's really got to me. The Commissioners themselves make an excellent team, I have to say. They're genuinely passionate about their work. More importantly, though, they are compassionate and they want to make a difference, but they're not naive. They know they follow in the footsteps of 57 previous inquiries over the last 20 or 30 years that now languish on dusty shelves somewhere. They know the pitfalls of government and the complexities of bureaucracies, and they understand now the unique ecosystem of defence and veterans. They decided to take 2 additional steps to make their report and their recommendations, or give them the best possible chance of making a difference. One we just heard on earlier, to create an independent body that would monitor the recommendations after they deliver their final report and would highlight those that had and those that hadn't been implemented. And 2 was to commission this book to show the public, the media, and our decision makers exactly what human damage had been caused by the estimated 3,000 or more veteran suicide over the recent past. By my calculation, a lost soul every 5 days. In this ecosystem lurks the kind of inertia once succinctly and cynically explained to me by an old mate who spent 40 years in the army. He said, "You've got to understand how they think, mate. Some of them, the only time they get off their arse is to cover it." Another one of their gems was, "It's only a rort if you're not in on it." Now, cynical, sure, but there is a germ of truth in that. It's all about culture, and culture and systems are created and maintained by leadership. More than 30 years ago, I asked my great friend and mentor, the late Phil Roden, who led a battalion on the Kokoda track at the age of 27, if he could define the spirit of the men who, against all the odds, preserved our liberty on that bloody track in 1942. And after long reflection, he said he believed it came down to three things. First, interdependence, one upon the other. Secondly, the ability to fight on when there's scarcely a breath left in your body for the sake of your mates. And thirdly, and I've always remembered this one, finally, respect for each other. I've never forgotten the answer. To this day, it remains the best definition of mateship I've ever heard. And this morning, as I look around at the leaders of our armed forces and the leaders of the organisations charged with supporting and caring for them and our veterans, I implore you to all aspire to that noble notion. I reflect on what we've learnt from the lived experience submissions that we've tried to encapsulate in the Shining a Light book. We saw betrayals by the very organisations to which many had devoted their whole lives. We saw cold and unbending systems wreak great personal pain. We saw individuals pushed to the edge, and for far too many, pushed past the limits of their endurance. We don't have the time this morning to, and it wouldn't be fair, to go and talk about individual stories. You'll see them in their own words when you read the book, and it's worth reading, let me tell you. One thing we learn stands out to me above all the others, though, and that is the vital role of leadership, or the lack of it, which played in so many stories. So many dark places could have been illuminated by leadership. So many lives could have been saved by it. So much pain to so many families could have been prevented. So many problems could have been solved by leaders who simply listened and then led. Allow me to just briefly refer to another one of my heroes, a man named Ralph Honour. Ralph was a genuine Renaissance man, a wonderful orator, a fine writer, a linguist, a great sportsman, a teacher, a lawyer, soldier, superb leader, and later in life a diplomat. Above all, a good man. One of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to meet. Ralph led the initial defence on the Kokoda track after being rushed back from the Middle East, where he escaped from Crete. Today he's recognised as one of Australia's finest tactical commanders. I hold him out today to you as a model of a genuine leader, because after the war he used his lawyer's skills and his peerless sense of fair play not to make money at the bar as a brilliant barrister, but as the chairman of the War Pensions Assessment Appeals Tribunal, a far less glamorous role, where he adjudicated on veterans' claims. And he did that because he cared about those who served. To me, that is what leadership looks like. It's not about creating or preserving a legacy. It is in fact about standing up for what you know to be right and protecting those whose lives and futures and those of their families have been entrusted to you. And speaking about Kokoda, that campaign that saved our liberty in World War II gives us some perspective to understand the stresses that we as a nation have imposed on our modern veterans in Iraq and in Afghanistan. That entire campaign in Kokoda lasted 6 months, and no one was in combat for the whole of that period. Yet we asked many of our modern veterans to serve in war amongst the people conditions, that's 24/7 combat readiness, for sometimes a dozen or more Kokoda equivalents. Can we even imagine the cumulative trauma that we exposed them to there? We owe them a massive duty of care and gratitude, and that is where the leadership comes in. The Royal Commission will hand down its report in little over a week's time. It'll be a seminal examination, an unvarnished and unflinching report card that our governments, our ADF and our bureaucrats cannot ignore. It should ignite a root and branch upheaval of our veterans' care ecosystem. And I implore our leaders to lead in supporting the implementation of the Commission's recommendations, certainly while you're in positions of power, but even after you leave them. Like Ralph Honour, use your undoubted leadership skills and your spheres of influence to help those who placed their lives in your hands. Whether it be DVA, the RSL, an ESO, or God forbid even politics, please take the lead. We heard Defence Minister Richard Marles tell the Commission's final hearing in Sydney that history will be our judge when referring to the government's response to the Commission's recommendations. He also said this needs to be a moment of change. He is dead right on both counts. I leave you with this ancient poem quoted by President John F. Kennedy in November of 1962 in a speech to his soldiers who had been deployed during the Cuban Missile Crisis the previous month. God and the soldier all men adore in times of trouble, but no more. For when the trouble's gone and all things are righted, God is forgotten and the old soldier slighted. Does that sound familiar to our vets? Kennedy concluded, this country does not forget God or the soldier. Upon both we now depend. I say, so do we. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Patrick. Thank you. I just now ask Dr. Peggy Brown to say a few words and also to present our book to the State Library. Peggy.
Can I just say that we are very proud of this book, Shining the Light. In essence, it encapsulates why a Royal Commission was established. As we've heard many times already this morning, people with lived experience told us they didn't feel that they had a voice, that their voice was being heard, or if it was being disregarded. This Royal Commission has heard their voice. We have heard their stories, and they have greatly assisted us at this Royal Commission in understanding the issues and informing the direction of our inquiry. Now, we did want to honour those who contributed to the Royal Commission through submissions, through private sessions, through appearing at hearings. And this book was a way of honouring that contribution. Now, obviously, we couldn't include everybody's accounts in this book, but let me tell you, the themes came up over and over again, and we hope it represents the stories of everybody. But we also wanted all of Australia to hear their voice and to understand why things must change. So I'd like to thank Patrick for his deep commitment to this, for his passion and for his wise words today. Anna, our book designer, and the whole team, and Patrick listed some of them from the Royal Commission, who worked very tirelessly behind the scenes to actually put this book together. It's a great pleasure now to be able to present it to Carolyn Butler-Bowden from the New South Wales State Library. We are actually distributing copies of the book to all of the state libraries and the National Library and some other libraries. We actually want this book to be available to the public. I know it's available online as a free downloadable version, but for posterity, for all time, we want the compelling messages in this book not to be lost. So thank you very much for accepting it and for making it available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I realise that military and veteran suicide has been a malignant, chronic problem since Federation.
But it wasn't until I endured this process and the way they treated me, the repercussions, it's now easy to identify that it's their actions that are causing veterans in peacetime to commit suicide.
What surprised me and shocked me was that those with the power to make change, leadership, government, I'm talking everywhere involved with defence, they should have known that this problem was so big.
I remember serving as a psychologist in the ADF, and I think at that time I too would have said, we're doing a great job.
What has surprised me and what continues to sadden me, disappoint me and anger me is the fact that it's still there and it's still happening as much as what it was happening and nothing's changed.
Look, I'd love to say I'm surprised by it, but I'm not. I'm heartbroken by it. The LGBTI community, we have our suicide rate is, exceptionally higher than the normal rate, and normal rate against veterans as well.
We've been greatly pleased that the Royal Commissioners are taking a more holistic view of looking into health and wellbeing of our serving ADF members, as well as veterans, as well as the families that support them more broadly.
I have in no way been surprised by the size and scale of the suicide crisis in defence and veteran community. And I think it is still underestimated because I do not think that all of our Defence Force members felt comfortable coming forward out of duty, honour, protection of career, protection of the Defence Force.
The important piece here is that we really identify these issues and we build systemic responses to support people both during their service and after their service. And I think that's what this Royal Commission has really tried to achieve.
Our three commissioners, Nick Caldis, Peggy Brown and James Douglas, commenced work back in July 2021. A former top cop, a respected psychiatrist and former Supreme Court judge. Their role has been to listen, investigate and recommend actions or changes to address systemic issues contributing to suicide and suicidal behaviours by serving and ex-serving Defence members. Today we have the opportunity to hear from each of them about their personal experiences, what they've learned over the last 3 years and their hopes for the future. First up, Commissioner James Douglas KC. Would you please welcome James to the stage?
Good morning. It's been an honour, a privilege and a great responsibility to serve as a Commissioner on this Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. The letters patent and our terms of reference have framed our endeavours over the last 3 years. They've helped shape our inquiries, formulate our questions and guide us in the conduct of the various forums the Royal Commission has convened. They've proven vitally important in our gathering of information and evidence. Ultimately, our task has been to answer the vexed question of why so many of our serving and ex-serving Australian Defence Force members die by suicide, why so many others attempt suicide, and what can be done to eliminate or minimise those risks. It's been an exhaustive investigation. Let me, for the moment, however, focus not so much on the extensive evidence we gathered as on the many anecdotal stories we listened to along the way. Although sometimes not substantial enough to make a clear line of inquiry, they shine a bright light on what we are dealing with in unique and memorable ways. There were the soldiers we would meet in our visits to barracks who said to us that they did not have the time to get to know their officers or be known well by them, because the officers moved on after 2 or 3 years in pursuit of further experience and promotion. Almost inevitably, relationships between them and the other and enlisted ranks remained, on the whole, fairly shallow. That was not the perception I had of my father's generation from World War II. While I had little military experience, my parents' generation had a lot, and I inherited some of that experience, sometimes almost by osmosis. As well as experiences within my family, many of the judges who presided over the courts where I practiced as a barrister and other senior figures I knew growing up had seen very active war service. They were mature and, on the whole, kind and thoughtful men, and they were practically all men when I was young. One thing I noticed was that the strong connection between those former officers and the men they commanded sometimes extended for decades into the future. They looked out for each other well into their later lives. I have been told, without much hard data, that today's military is less like that. Some have explained it as the difference between the citizens' armies of the 2 world wars and the professional forces we deploy now. That may be so. For me, though, the focus on leadership and accountability in our inquiries has been influenced by the belief expressed to me privately by a very experienced veteran that leadership, at its bottom line, is about caring for the men and women under one's command. I hope that my concerns about the modern military are not reflective of an attitude of us and them between the commissioned officers and the other ranks and enlisted members. The significant proportion of our officers who have risen through the ranks, including 2 of the current service chiefs, and the superior level of education I've seen among many enlisted members suggest my fears may not be well founded. But it's not only a matter of education. Bad cultures can be passed on. I've been immensely saddened by the many stories I've heard during my time as Commissioner, particularly those told to me in private sessions. My initial scepticism of the function of the private sessions, partly because they did not constitute evidence as I knew it, and partly because my training and experience was not that of a counsellor, fell away when I began to realise that those who came to speak to us in private were exposing much more of their deepest feelings than one would expect from a witness in a public hearing. It was not evidence, but compelling background information, and helped inform our lines of inquiry very significantly. The suffering of so many who were trying to do their best but faced challenge after challenge, either with the horrors of war or the way they were treated by their colleagues or commanders, has been shocking. There are several brave stories which stand out vividly because of the visceral pain the participants suffered, because of the behaviour of the enemy, or staggeringly because of their treatment within our own military. Serving your country should not have to come at so great a cost. I was also particularly struck by occasions where participants were let down by the military justice system. This is a system that is supposed to service people fairly and impartially, but many have argued it is too closely linked to the military command structure itself. Indeed, it is embedded in the ADF structure and may be perceived as too beholden to those in command. I shall say something more about military justice shortly. High rates of suicide and suicidality among serving and ex-serving military personnel are not problems exclusive to Australia. In line with our terms of reference, we examined how Australia's Five Eyes partners, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada and New Zealand, are responding to similar challenges in their military communities. We have looked at what has and has not worked for our closest allies and what might work if applied in the Australian context. In our travels to the Five Eyes partners, we came across evidence of coordinated research work done through different types of organisations. In Canada, there's a significant central medical and scientific research body embedded in their military and defence organisations. In the UK, there are well set up academic research networks intended to be more independent of the military. And in the USA, there's a large network of in-house treating and research institutions, prominent among which is the Walter Reed National Military Medical Centre outside Washington, DC. We had the privilege of inspecting that facility. It became obvious to us during those consultations overseas that what we were doing was of great interest to our colleagues abroad. They have similar issues within their military forces, and we were told several times that our report would be examined carefully by them when it was published. We hope that it can provide a useful source of advice for years to come. It has been more wide-ranging, comprehensive, and focused on the problem of suicide than some of their own inquiries. We also hope, in the light of our findings overseas, that the various research institutions here investigating military medical health can work cooperatively to coordinate their focus on issues we discuss in our report. This Royal Commission has been responding to a national crisis decades in the making. Despite the government establishing a Royal Commission and the legislature wanting certain matters investigated, obtaining critical information from Commonwealth bodies in a timely manner has been difficult at times. That has been disappointing, to say the least. As well, a complex matrix of legal and policy issues has affected our important work, and as has been well publicised, we have encountered significant hurdles. The need to gather evidence sensitively without compromising issues of national security has also affected the conduct of our inquiries. Yet we have risen above these challenges to achieve a thorough examination of all aspects of service and post-service life to identify the risk and protective factors for military suicide. The military is an extraordinary ecosystem, much of it opaque to the outside observer. Everything is interconnected. An issue in one area has a flow-on effect in many others. Defence and veteran suicide is a multifactorial problem to which there is no single solution. It must be attacked on a broad front, as we seek to do in our report. Now is not the occasion to say what we have concluded, but I can say something about areas we have considered. We have examined the interrelationship between government and non-government service and support providers to understand how effectively they respond to the needs of our most vulnerable defence veterans. We've heard directly from serving and ex-serving ADF members and their family and relatives, many of whom have themselves been touched by suicide or suicidality. We've worked closely with the academic and research community, veterans groups and charitable organisations, commissioning research and conducting workshops and roundtables on a diverse range of specific matters. It's apparent that exposure to the military justice system can seriously affect the mental health and well-being of perpetrators and victims alike. The extent of that damage needs further assessment, and Defence must address deficiencies in governance, accountability and assurance mechanisms to ensure it can monitor, manage and respond to risks arising from the administration of military justice. Structural changes within the military justice system may also contribute to the ADF being a safer place for women who presently experience a higher rate of suicide and sexual assault compared to women in the general population. The first significant shock I experienced early on in our inquiries was to hear about the very elevated levels of suicide among female veterans. It is evident there remain deeply entrenched cultural problems within the ADF that require urgent attention. Let me speak a little bit more about the future. My hope for the outcome of this Royal Commission is that we will have set in train a process that results in a significant drop in suicide rates in our military community. It should also have the effect that the ADF becomes both more cohesive and effective in its primary function of defending Australia and its national interests. This needs explaining. Progress will have to be maintained by assessments of the results of our work over time by the permanent body we have suggested in our interim report. This may see adjustments made and our approach to the problem evolve. Suicide and suicidality are unlikely to remain static issues. Areas such as the consequences of traumatic brain injury, for example, will continue to attract further research. By embracing change and monitoring and reporting against the issue, those in command and our support services can help better equip future generations of the Australian Defence Force physically, mentally and emotionally. This will not only benefit the ADF and national security, but the Australian families who support our military in making their inestimable sacrifices for our country. In closing, may I reiterate what a great privilege it has been to participate in this Royal Commission. I also wish to thank my fellow commissioners for their support, friendship and assistance in sometimes challenging times. We have shared a single vision in our endeavours to solve this problem and have been supported wholeheartedly by our loyal, capable and hard-working in-house staff and legal team. I thank them all and thank you.
Without the Royal Commission, I think a lot of the actions of the ADF would have been buried, such as my brother's death. I think those serving deserve the truth. And I think for the parents of those considering a career in the ADF, this is the most important information you could potentially hear or get your hands on.
It's really important to shine a light on what is happening to serving personnel and ex-serving personnel. So many of these deaths were preventable. I truly believe that one of the deaths that was preventable was my son. I will never know, but I truly believe it was preventable. But nobody that could do something really cared.
The Royal Commission has given many people an opportunity to speak their truth. The Royal Commission has exposed deep-seated issues and the lack of collaborative efforts between all the people that were meant to be supporting veterans and their families.
Really bringing these issues out into the open has been absolutely fundamental. Now we know that these issues exist and are out, the sunlight has been shone on them, we can actually start to address them. People have had those aha moments. People have had those opportunities to really sit back and reflect on their own practice and what they might be able to do better or what resources they might need to be able to enhance what they're already doing.
Attending the hearings gave me an opportunity to see how much the Royal Commission has been able to voice what we couldn't, which is why we fought so long and so hard for a Royal Commission in the first place.
I personally have found listening to some of the evidence very disturbing, and I imagine there has been closed evidence that the commissioners have heard be described as just totally and utterly revolting.
Without this Royal Commission, the statistics were never going to change.
The Royal Commission has really shone a light on this issue. I think it has allowed us to have a very mature conversation as a society about what is a very dark and complicated issue for a lot of people.
I believe many of the issues that were brought to light will have been a shock to many of the Australian public who believe that defence personnel are well looked after during their service and after.
I do need to point out that Whilst DVA and our system does have hiccups, it is still one of the world best standards for veterans and their families. So I think calling it out is fair, but I think we need to bring Defence along that learning curve and make them accountable for these types of injuries and these experiences that people are suffering.
The Royal Commission's been incredibly good at making our community feel heard, letting people tell their stories and feel validated, understood and recognised for the first time ever.
We don't want people to spiral as a result of this Royal Commission. We want them to reflect, but we also want to bring about some degree of confidence or an opportunity to play a part. Everybody in society has an opportunity to play a part in this.
We hope that through this it will lead to those who are in those positions of power to be able to create meaningful change.
Commissioners have spoken at length about the need for a powerful, independent body going forward to ensure government acts on their recommendations. They've stressed the need for bipartisan support and for these issues not to be politicised. But what is the role of Parliament in holding government and its agencies, the ADF and the Departments of Defence and Veterans Affairs, to account? To share her thoughts, would you please welcome Senator Jacqui Lambie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me here today. We're here because veterans and their families wouldn't let the stories and the experiences of their loved ones be lost. We owe a great debt of thanks to them and their testimony and the work of the commissioners. It must be heard and it must bring change. It must. I would like to acknowledge the Chair of the Royal Commission in Defence and Veteran Suicide, Mr Nick Caldis, and his fellow Commissioners, Dr Peggy Brown and the Honourable James Douglas. I understand there is also dignitaries in the room. Thank you for coming. But most importantly, I want to acknowledge the veterans in the room, the mothers and the families who have fought for years for justice and for stories of their loved ones to be heard. It's because of them that we're all here today. Australians are used to hearing me give Defence and the Department of Veterans Affairs a hard time. But to be clear, I loved my time in the Army. Defence's mission and purpose is to defend Australia and its national interests to advance Australia's security and prosperity. But how can we do that effectively unless we care for our veterans, when they're in service and when they leave? Better still, just because they have a physical injury, it doesn't mean they are less capable of giving service. You can't tell me that just because you've lost a limb, you couldn't work as an admin clerk or in logistics. You have PTSD, but you can't drive a truck? What rubbish. What rubbish. Just an excuse to throw them out instead of finding reasons to keep them in. That is half the battle, and the battle that does need to be tended to. I was only 18 years old when I went through basic training at Kapooka. In those days, there was no Facebook, there was no FaceTime, no mobile phones. After 3 weeks of hardcore training, we were allowed one call home. I remember filling the telephone box with my coins. I could have rung Dad or my mum. I chose my mum. I had one chance to show her how tough I was and blew it. She answered. Mum, I cried, you've got to get me the hell out of here. I don't belong here. Anyway, in a calm tone, my mother said, no, you'll be right. You give me a ring when you're feeling better. And then she hung up, left me stranded, hung me out to dry, as I like to remind her. This was typical of my mum's tough love approach. Dad told me later he would have come and got me, God bless him, he would have taken me right out of there. I did love my time in the Army, I truly did. And if my body had held up, no doubt I'd probably be sitting in one of these front rows here, no doubt, making change. When I joined, there was a shortage of women who wanted to have a shot at being in a combat unit. We called them field force back then. It was early days for women like me. We were treated more like guinea pigs than soldiers. I was getting closer to moving up the ranks into the sergeant level courses. I felt like I was getting somewhere, but I had back pain and it had been getting worse. I was still young and naive enough to think eventually it would go away. In 1999, East Timor held elections and voted for their independence. The aftermath was unrest and violence, so Prime Minister John Howard decided to send an ADF to international force. I was excited, not because I was pleased about the troubling situation in the Timorese, but as one of the few females with combat training in the military police unit, I knew I could finally get into some action. Then it was 1999. There had been little overseas military action since Vietnam. The Army didn't even have flat jackets and had to borrow a load of them from our US counterparts. During the fit-out, I leaned over to pick one up and one of the guys grabbed it for me, dropped it over my head, and it was all downhill from there. The flak jacket hit my shoulders and I hit the floor. I was in agonising pain and the game of hiding my back injury was finally over for me. And the doctor made it quite clear, you're not going anywhere. I have to say Defence did everything that they could. They flew me to specialists all over the country, but sadly my time in active service was over and the Army eventually gave me medical discharge in March 2000. I have called the next 10 years of my life my lost decade, or 10 years of my living hell. Defence had done all it could to help me, but the Department of Veterans Affairs did all they could to destroy me. It certainly felt like that at the time, and I have to say I have not changed my mind on that. I didn't know anything about compensation. I'd never thought about it. In the early days, I thought that the DVA would get me the help I needed and then eventually I would be able to serve again. I was dreaming, but it wasn't a dream, it was an actual nightmare, not a nightmare that was especially tough on my sons. Instead of DVA treating me like a veteran that needed support, they treated me like a criminal trying to rot the system. There is a saying within the veterans community to describe the methods the DVA uses when dealing with its own veterans: delay, deny, and wait for us to die. DVA spied on me, they lied to me and accused me of being a malingerer. And at the end of my lost decade, I was broke. I had burned through my superannuation fighting them, and I was literally physically broken. After 9 years, the haze of pain and depression started to clear, and I had a new fire in my belly. I wanted to help veterans and their families that had been through what I went through. My determination to get into politics was born from that fire, and that fire was started by the culture of the Department of Veterans Affairs, a culture that sought to silence veterans and their families. I wanted to get myself into rooms with decision makers so I could make a difference for veterans like myself, and I wanted to shield their children from what my children had been through. Once I took my seat in the Senate, it felt like every veteran in Australia had reached out to me to tell their stories. I was overloaded, and so were the staff. However, I was oddly comforted that I was not alone, and I was appalled that the consecutive governments hadn't done anything to fix it. As a matter of most of the fixing was just band-aids, and it usually just made it worse. I called for a Royal Commission in my first speech in the Senate in 2014. In the years that followed, we called on the Australian public to back us in the fight, and millions of Australians finally had our backs. We ran ads in marginal seats, we organised rallies, and we started petitions. But I was just adding my voice to a voice that had already been going on for years. The first calls for a Royal Commission come from veterans in the early 1980s. By the early 2000s, veterans' parents had started drawing chalk outlines of their dead kids outside the Department of Veterans Affairs offices. In 2010, it was carried on by the peacekeepers and peacemakers of Mick Quinn and Rod Thompson. They kept the fight up. Every time someone wore out, someone else picked up the torch. By 2019, an army of mothers, fathers, veterans and their families were no longer asking for a Royal Commission. They were now demanding it, and they were not giving up. Mothers like Karen Bird, who lost her son Jesse to suicide in June 2017. Jesse was a veteran of Afghanistan. And he struggled with mental health issues on his return to civilian life. But Jesse didn't get the help he needed, and Karen soon joined the chorus, calling out, delay, deny, die. Julian Finney's son, David, was a poster boy for the Australian Defence Force. They used his handsome face for recruiting ads. David was popular, smart, and he received a bravery commendation. But the sudden death of David's infant son in 2007, coupled with traumatic on-water situations with refugees, set in a motion of serious mental health issues for David. But like Jesse, instead of giving David the help he needed, Navy worked hard to get David out, and by 2019, he was another statistic he'd taken his life. Another mother who joined the fight was Nikki Jamison. Nikki's son Daniel, 21-year-old Army private, took his own life because he felt trapped after being singled out and repeatedly bullied and belittled by the Defence leadership. Nikki was kept in the dark about her son's declining health. Colleen Pillam joined the fight in 2019. Her son Michael had also been bullied and then managed out of the Army when the mental impact of the bullying became apparent. In 2019, these mothers come to Canberra and knocked directly on the doors of power. They knew how to do the job. I helped facilitate a meeting with Scott Morrison, then Prime Minister, who listened coldly and made no commitments to give these mothers what they were asking for. It was simple, a royal commission. The Morrison government suggested a national commissioner, someone appointed by the government who would have no power whatsoever to compel witnesses or documents. How was that going to be helpful? The National RSL and the usual suspects backed in the idea of the National Commissioner and said that no Royal Commission was needed. Nothing to see here, at least nothing that they could have had control over. These mothers and other veterans had been warned they would be resisted, and they were given full support from the Vietnam veterans who had been living with DVA's poor record of supporting veterans for years. Finally, on the 8th of July 2021, the Morrison government gave in and announced a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. It had been a long time coming. It was a victory for all those mothers, those veterans and their families. The Royal Commission's work would finally begin. There was a relief but also dread. Each one of these Australians would now have to revisit their trauma, and they would have to retell their stories to these commissioners once again. On August the 11th, the commissioners released their interim report, and their number one recommendation was harmonising the veteran compensation and rehabilitation legislation. The commissioners made it quite clear that Australia's veteran compensation and rehabilitation legislative system is so complicated that it impacts on the mental health of some veterans, both serving and ex-serving ADF members, and was at times a contributing factor to veterans ending their own lives. I think you would have been hard-pressed to find a veteran that didn't agree. I remember fighting my way through the dark forest of rules and regulations during my time under DVA, and it was a dark, isolating hell. I have to say the legislation to harmonise the compensation legislation is a little late, but Minister Keogh has tried to move quickly to act on this, and that legislation is close to being ready for Parliament. Although I'm sure it won't be perfect. I say that politely, there is no other choice but to move forward and have some trust that the Minister will smooth out any bumps in the road when I'm able to make him aware of them. I'll be right on his tail and be calling it out. I have to thank Matt since he's been in. He's been extremely helpful. I don't have anything bad today to say about him just yet. But we'll wait. So thanks, Matty. I do appreciate it. The second recommendation was to eliminate the backlog of claims. On this, I have to say the Department of Veterans Affairs is working hard, I do believe that, and they are stacking up staff as quickly as they can find them that are suitable in those positions. I would also like to acknowledge the work of Secretary Alison Frame, who is also here today. Despite some claims moving at a faster pace, there are still others lagging behind, or as one advocate put it to me, it's a patchwork. That's because some of these claims fall under more pieces of legislation. The harmonisation should help that. But for people who have literally been waiting for years, this cannot come soon enough for you, and I know that. The Department of Veterans Affairs and Mr Keogh, like I said, I believe are working extremely hard to change that system. In the interim report, the Commissioners noted that there have been numerous reports and inquiries done since 2000. These are relevant to the topics of suicide and suicidality among servicing and ex-servicing members. They identified over 50 previous reports, more than 750 recommendations, while acknowledging that many of these reports and inquiries were about discrete topics. The Commissioners noted their dismay at the lack of response by Australian governments to previous recommendations. I share that dismay and lack of actions, as do many hundreds of thousands of veterans that are out there. When the Royal Commission was established, there were at least 1,600 deaths by suicide between 1997 and 2020 that we know of. That's more than 20 times the number killed in active duty over roughly the same amount of time. These numbers do not include serving or ex-serving members whose deaths were not officially recorded as suicide. I am aware of many cases where veterans have ended their lives in car accidents, making a last-ditch sacrifice so any life insurance they may have had could still be claimed by their families. When the interim report was released, there was relief that some of the core problems were identified. There was also acceptance that there was still a long way to go. The commissioners acknowledged that this Royal Commission was, and I quote, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make real and lasting change, end quote. As you can imagine, I spent a great deal of time thinking about how the Department of Veterans Affairs and Defence, changed with the care of veterans, has so utterly failed to support these Australians who are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for their country. It's a problem with the culture, a culture that reflexively protects the institution instead of protecting its people. I think if you switch that around, you're going to have much better results with your people. Start putting them first. It's not about the institution. In September 2023, appropriately in suicide prevention work, Commissioner Cowdis called out this culture. 2 years into the Royal Commission, the Defence establishment was still dragging its feet. Commissioner Cowdis told the assembled journalists at the National Press Club that veterans were still being driven to suicide 2 years after the Royal Commission was launched. Mr Cowdis's words, and I quote, Defence's approach to investigating and reporting on suicides has progressed at a snail's pace. End quote, a pace every veteran in this room is familiar with. Commissioner Cowdis also called for, and I quote, an enduring, powerful, independent, end quote, oversight body needed to make sure the government agencies and the Defence Force prioritise the long-term reforms necessary to take veterans' suicide crisis. Commissioner Cowdis also reminded us that the Defence Force had failed to take a damning 2016 report into abuse, bullying and harassment as a wake-up call to lift its game. I read through those folders. How the hell you never lifted your game after that? Maybe it would have helped if the government of the day had actually let you see those files. So for people out there, these people didn't get to see those files. They were not shown because the government didn't want it cleaned up either. I'll call that out now. It is troubling to imagine that such behaviour persists in any modern-day workplace, he said. In my view, it's not just troubling, it goes to the root of the cultural problem in Defence. Instead of responding to criticism, what can we do about attitude? Defence closes ranks, pulls up the drawbridge and says nothing to see here. That is not helpful. Commissioner Cowdis and his fellow commissioners did not expect to be stonewalled when they asked Defence for documents, but that's exactly what happened. Even with a Royal Commission going on, Defence is still holding on to documents. This isn't what I mean by a problem with the culture. This is what I mean by a problem with the culture. Take the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force, the IDADF. This agency is essential for the justice system within Defence. It was set up 20 years ago and has never been audited. When I pushed the Australian National Audit Office to do an audit, the Secretary of Defence thought he'd stick his big beak in and said, don't bother doing that. Had a little chat with him. How about that? Not so independent, the Audit Office anymore either. And so we didn't get an audit, we got a review. That's right, because I carried on, and so you know what, I just got someone, I went down to the AG's office and I said, listen mate, this is going on here, that's how we speak to each other. He was very nice, he said, well I'll give you a review then. Right, that's great, okay, that's great, that was a good start. So the Minister of Defence, it took 3 months to do this review, it was done very quickly, and now the Minister of Defence, Minister Miles, has been holding on to that review for 5 months, and I don't even know if these guys have got it. Jesus, I tell you, if he's had it for 5 months, you've got to say, I cannot wait to get the popcorn and read the juicy bits, because fair income, it must be bloody great, right? I don't know how you fix up your legal problems if you can't see a report where you can see where the problems are. This is what I mean about the problem with culture. When they find the problems, they aren't transparent. They don't move quickly to address the issue, and they ignore or fail to put through the recommendations that could actually make a difference. In 2021, Defence told the Commissioners that the suicide rate among serving members of the ADF was lower than the general population. In 2022, the Chief of Defence Force reiterated these points based on evidence at the time. But the Royal Commission did its own analysis and found that Defence's understanding of the risk of suicide among current serving ADF members does not necessarily hold true. At least 1,677 serving ADF members who served on or 1st of July 1985 died by suicide, 1997 to 2021, and that's the official figure. The Royal Commission believes the true toll of these preventable deaths could be up to 3,000. I still think you're being quite conservative. When Australians join the ADF, they give up many rights and liberties enjoyed by most Australian citizens. We agreed to do what we're told. We agreed to live where we're told. All in the defence of our nation. We voluntarily accept the risk of service, which often means physical or mental injury, and sometimes they end up also with a moral injury. And all they ask for in return is that their nation looks after them during and after their service. Is that really too much to ask? We cannot let this Royal Commission go on the way of the reports and inquiries that preceded them. It cannot just sit on a shelf gathering dust while defence establishment moves on and nothing changes. The world is more unpredictable than ever, and we have never needed a strong ADF more than what we need it today. But veterans are leaving and no one wants to join. Who would want to join an organisation that treats its workforce with such contempt? I call on the government and defence leaders in this room and around Australia to honour the work of this commission and to honour the sacrifices of all the veterans, the mothers, the fathers and the families who have worked so hard to make this happen. So when these recommendations are released in a couple of weeks, implement them. Not in 10 years' time, not in 5 years' time, now. You've heard them, I don't know how many times I have to now say, we want that commissioner put in place. And if you're not already looking for someone to fill that spot, then you're already failing to get your job done. That is the expectation from the veterans. There will be a national commissioner put back in place with more powers than the original one so we can actually get the job done. That is what I'm asking for. That is what they are asking for, and I'm making that quite clear because I am hearing those little gossips in the columns up there. You are not getting away with this. We want a war commissioner. We want a national commissioner. That is what we're asking for, and that is the expectation, and we want them starting as soon as possible. In about 4 weeks' time will be good. I just want to say a couple more words. I want to put this quite simply. We owe them, and we will always owe our veterans. Our dedication to them must match their dedication and service to this country. Always. Thank you.
I think days like Anzac Day and Remembrance Day remind Australians we have a Defence Force. I think in their everyday, they don't even realise it's there. And they don't realise it's there because we don't talk about it.
Everyone has a role to play when it comes to suicide prevention. As we say in suicide prevention, it's everyone's business.
We mustn't forget the homeless veterans, we mustn't forget the veterans in crisis, we mustn't forget the families that have been broken apart.
I'm not qualified, I'm simply a mum, but when I listen to people, they'll often tell you what they need if you just stop and listen.
What we need is to acknowledge that we all have responsibility to each other all the time.
This is totally unacceptable, the way it's playing out right now. We're having 3 veterans commit suicide every 14 days, purely due to failed leadership. And no one is fighting for change.
We all have a part to play. We must help to shed a light on what is broken so as to assist saving defence and veterans' lives.
I work with a lot of veterans and I see every day the skills and resilience and contribution that they make to our society and their families too.
I do believe there needs to be a greater interest in the well-being of veterans and their families. These are people who signed on to serve their country knowing that they could one day pay the ultimate price for their country, or that if they were injured or ill whilst they were serving, that they'd be looked after. And that's something that I guess we all believe. To know that it's not the case really is a national crisis.
It doesn't matter who implemented the Royal Commission, it doesn't matter who finished it. We just want to make sure that any government of the day is responsible and looking after our servicemen and women, given the strategic implications if they don't.
Every single Australian, every single policymaker, every single government official, every single ex-service organisation has a responsibility to reduce suicide.
Everybody absolutely has a part to play, but I think they should be playing their part already, and if we get that part right, then we're going to rebuild that honour, that integrity, that pride within our service people, and when they leave, they can leave successfully because they can see where they can go next. If you can't see where you can go next, then you're lost already.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time now to hear from Dr. Peggy Brown AO as she reflects on her time as Commissioner. Please welcome Commissioner.
Gather here today to mark the closing of the Commission, it is appropriate to reflect on our journey. From the day Commissioners were announced on the 8th of July 2021 with only an official secretary to assist us, through the challenges of selecting counsel assisting, solicitors assisting and recruiting a full complement of staff during a pandemic, and establishing not one but 4 different offices over the life of the Commission, and the many machinations of conducting this inquiry, it has been, as one staff member described recently, a roller coaster experience. In fact, what she said was it's like riding the most terrifying roller coaster in the world. It strikes me that perhaps the roller coaster analogy applies equally to a life in service. Some don't meet the criteria to join the ride, and for others, it comes with health warnings. But for those on the ride, it goes through ups and downs, twists and turns, delivering exhilaration and heart-stopping moments. Some thrive on it and sign up to do it over and over again, while others don't particularly enjoy the experience and can't wait for it to end. And yet the roller coaster ride doesn't necessarily end when a member separates from Defence. Life after service can be just as unpredictable, full of ups and downs, unexpected curls and loops, uncertainty about what is happening, feeling unable to control it, and all manner of other emotional responses as well. So what are my reflections on 3 years at the Defence and Veteran Suicide Royal Commission? Well, we were appointed to better understand the circumstances faced by veterans who died by suicide or who experienced suicidality, and to learn what could be done better so that others facing similar circumstances, death by suicide would not be the outcome. We wanted to identify the real root of the problems, leading so many to think about suicide, to attempt suicide, or to take their own lives when they believed that there was no other option. Now I ask you to pause for a moment and put yourself in the shoes of a young person whose dream has been to join the ADF and serve their country, perhaps carrying on a family tradition. Imagine their excitement and pride at being successful in their application to join, emotions that carried through to recruit training, mixed perhaps there with a twinge of anxiety, uncertainty at what lies ahead for them. Then fast forward, weeks, months, or maybe even years, to when that same person no longer feels proud or excited, but rather is feeling weary, dejected, devalued, demoralised, and perhaps, because of what they've experienced, even feeling betrayed
by the very institution they regarded so highly and worked so hard to join. They feel there's nowhere for them to turn to get assistance. None of the available options really feel viable to them. They don't want to let their team down, but then again, they no longer feel like they belong to the team. They no longer believe in the ideal of service, but they don't want to let their family down. They want out, but worry about what the future looks like in a civilian world that they don't know. And who can they really talk to? Because it all comes with such a heavy emotional toll that's so hard to put into words. This, in essence, is a story we heard repeatedly during this Royal Commission. It's not hard to grasp that this is where suicidal thoughts take root and grow. Historically in society and within armed forces worldwide, and even in some quarters still today, the person in this vignette would be seen as the problem. They would be deemed to not have the strength of character, the resilience, or whatever else it takes to succeed in service, and any suicidal actions or behaviours they may exhibit would be seen as their choice, and even as further evidence of their weakness of character or their unsuitability for service. And if this is the lens through which veteran suicide is perceived, it's perhaps little wonder that there's been only limited attempts to look deeply at the system behind the person and what may be occurring at a systemic level to lead to such tragic outcomes for individuals. We know that since the turn of this century there's been at least 57 reviews or inquiries looking into aspects of service and post-service life that may be related in some way to suicide or suicidality. Yet at the beginning of this Royal Commission, and even until the beginning of this year, Defence did not accept, at least publicly, that there was a nexus between service and the tragic death of veterans by suicide. DVA was perhaps a little less intransigent about their possible contribution, but was not also wholeheartedly embracing the need for fundamental change. For a range of reasons, existing oversight bodies also did not seem well placed to assist Defence and DVA to contemplate the alternative viewpoint. When there is such limited systemic understanding of the problem, is it any wonder that actions to date have had limited effect on the veteran suicide rate? The prevailing view within an organisation will inevitably colour the application of its efforts to bring about change. Over the past 3 years, we have identified many circumstances during service and post-service that can contribute to defence and veteran suicide. Now, we all know that suicide is a complex phenomenon and there is no one cause. But we've identified issues related to recruitment and initial training, to the demands of service life, the unacceptable behaviours that take such a heavy toll on service members, and the application of the military justice system, which may exacerbate rather than ameliorate that toll. We found inadequacies in injury prevention, in the healthcare system, in career management, and in the transition experience. And post-discharge, there are innumerable challenges with DVA and its processes, as well as other support systems. Across the board, there are inadequate supports for families when they most need it, yet families are a strong protective factor for most veterans. And overlying all of these issues, we've also identified strong themes around culture, inadequate governance processes, and insufficient accountability at multiple levels that have allowed and sometimes enabled harms to be perpetrated or to go unaddressed, and for suicidality and suicide to continue as a way in which serving and ex-serving personnel seek to solve their pain and escape the desperate state of hopelessness. Now, our final report, which we hand to the Governor-General on September the 9th, will present our understanding of these issues and our recommendations. And I am mindful that it will not achieve everything that everyone wants to see. Some will no doubt be disappointed that we haven't pursued individuals or delivered the retribution or prosecutions they desire to see. Others may have issues they wanted the Royal Commission to probe and report on, and may be frustrated if we have not done so. In the time we had available, we focused on identifying the systemic issues as our terms of reference required. We prioritised examination of the areas where the most risk exists and where changes have the best prospect of reducing harm for the most people into the future. Another key point to make is that realistically, not everything that needs to change can be done at once. The necessary changes will take time, will need to evolve, and sustained effort will be required to achieve them, supported by strong leadership that's informed by profound insight into the nature of the problem. Not denial, not lip service, but a true understanding of the complex interwoven factors arising from service and post-service that contribute to suicidality and death by suicide. Real-time monitoring and honest, open reporting of progress and true accountability will also be critical, aided by external oversight. No matter how sincere their efforts, this is not a problem that Defence and DVA can be trusted to solve by themselves. We have seen too often that Defence's default position is to defend Defence, and too much evidence of busy work at both Defence and DVA giving the appearance of implementing change when in reality they've served only to perpetuate old ways of operating. Earnest efforts to effect change, strong accountability and external oversight must be a part of the picture going forwards. There is no quick fix, but nor can they adopt the position of the Royal Commission is gone now, we can go back to doing it our way. There must be a continued drive for reform, to analyse results and to innovate, and a true commitment to tackling the many issues contributing to defence and veteran suicide. And government has a responsibility to ensure this. As we've heard, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence said in March, history will be our judge, and indeed it will be. But that doesn't just apply to the current Australian government. This Royal Commission has noted the failing of past governments to adequately address the tragedy of veteran suicide. History will not only be the judge of the current government, but all future governments, as well as state and territory governments, and everyone else with the ability to change the future in this space, including secretaries of departments, senior leaders in the ADF and ESOs. Everyone in this landscape has the opportunity to create a better future for our veterans and their families. Parliamentarians, bureaucrats, leaders, service personnel, community organisations, service providers, academics, the media and the community at large. This Royal Commission has drawn a line in the sand and is asking you all to do your part in driving change, indeed demanding change when it is not happening. The International Veteran Community is watching, and Australia will be judged on its response to this Royal Commission. We have the opportunity to set the benchmark and to be the leader for armed forces around the world, many of which we know struggle with the same issues that we have identified and the same tragic outcome of veteran suicide. Australia needs a strong, resilient and capable Defence Force now more than ever. But to achieve that, it has to let go of old ways of working and being, and embrace a more compassionate and contemporary Defence Force. A Defence Force where capability, strength and resilience are built on rigorous evidence-based training and skills development, balanced with self-care, rather than on a culture that tolerates or promotes false ideals, exceptionalism or abuse. Abuse of any kind does not toughen someone up, whether it's excessive, harsh training, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, administrative abuse, abuse of power, or neglect of safety and well-being. It may create a superficial veneer of toughness, but every abusive blow does damage to the core of the person, and eventually the veneer can crumble and suicide can be the tragic result. Now, it's said that culture is a capability multiplier. Military culture has deep roots and deeply ingrained ways of doing things. It shapes a military capability. But society has changed, warfighting has changed, and military culture and leadership need to change too if our contemporary capability is to be maximised. There must be a willingness to do things fundamentally differently, not just simply a better version of the same old things. Now, in the last 6 months, we have, at last, heard senior defence leaders acknowledge the nexus between service and the risk of suicide and commit to change. We now need them to deliver on their newly gained insights, remembering, of course, that their people are their greatest asset. Now, Australia needs a veteran rehabilitation and compensation system that is fair and just, but where the focus is on assisting veterans to lead satisfying and contributing lives in their communities, regardless of any injury or illness. Whilst our veteran rehabilitation and compensation scheme may be regarded internationally as one of, if not the most generous, unfortunately, for too long, this same generous system has been a further contributor to the harm veterans have experienced. For too many, it has not enabled their recovery or offered a way forward to a meaningful and productive life after service. Rather, it has kept them stuck in a very unhappy and unsafe space, forever resentful, disconnected and distrustful. Again, a deep understanding of the systemic factors leading to this outcome is required to prevent continuing harm. It has been positive to see that DVA's leaders have committed to change within their organisation, and indeed we have seen examples of positive change occurring within DVA during the life of this Royal Commission, enabled in part by the additional permanent staffing provided by government following our interim report. But the road ahead for DVA remains long, perhaps longer than they appreciate. Years of neglect by successive governments have delivered a DVA that for many years has simply not enabled the best outcomes for our veterans. Broad changes are required, but recognising the problems, seeking to address them and engaging widely with veterans and their families is the best route to getting better outcomes. ESOs are an important source of support for veterans, but they need to demonstrate the best of what they learned in defence, not the worst. They need to recognise their mission is to put the veteran first always, before their egos and logos, and show the hallmarks of teamwork, collaboration, communication, trust and strategy, coming together and pursuing excellence in support of delivering the best veteran services possible across the country. Again, it's very promising that ESO leaders have recognised the need for change and expressed a commitment to achieving this. But they must now convert their words to action and sustain the effort towards a more unified service offering. States and territories have an important role too. Veterans fight for our nation, and this is one space where cooperative federalism needs to shine through. Veterans and their families want consistency across jurisdictional borders. They know governments can do great things when they work together, if they choose to prioritise it. Our service personnel and veterans have fought for you, the people of Australia. It's now time to reciprocate and fight for them. Support the veterans in your community and their families. Don't just think of them on Anzac Day and Remembrance Day. Make sure you keep abreast of the recommendations made by this Royal Commission and whether the necessary level of change is happening. and let your local member, know that you'll be watching. And to our veterans, I urge you to invest in your own recovery, just as you do or did in your service, where you gave it your all. The concept of recovery is not about a cure where you no longer have an illness or any symptoms or disability. It's about focusing on your strengths and making the most of what you can do with what you've got, not being defined by what you can no longer do or what you no longer have. Satisfaction and happiness will come from striving towards purpose in your life. Connecting with others is an important first step. And there are many organisations out there that can assist you with a sense of belonging and finding that purpose after your military service concludes. Please let them in and allow them to help you. Now, early in the life of this Royal Commission, we asked ourselves what success looks like. Obviously, seeing a reduction in the rate of suicide is an ultimate goal, but it should not be the yardstick by which this commission is judged. What I wanted to see was Defence owning the problem and acknowledging their contribution and the need to do things differently. For DVA to rise out of its state of learned helplessness and be able to effectively assist all veterans who need help. For ESOs to put veterans first, and for all governments to work together in a coordinated fashion, despite the challenges of federalism. I think we've already seen the beginnings of all of those things during the life of this Royal Commission, largely as a result of the Royal Commission. Those sparks of change are part of the legacy of this Royal Commission, but perhaps even more important is the lesson to listen to the voices of those with lived experience in the defence and veteran sector. We are stronger when we embrace their truth and allow ourselves to be informed by it, no longer attempting to diminish it or hide from it. The Royal Commission has had a lot of support from a lot of people to be able to get to this point. Within the defence and veteran communities, across government departments, across ESO communities, and from academics, researchers, institutions and oversight bodies. And I would like to thank everyone who has supported us, and in particular those with lived experience and the staff of the Royal Commission who've put their hearts and souls into the work. Make no mistake, the challenges along this rollercoaster ride were plenty. And there is little doubt that many of us bear some scars from the internal and external wrangling of the last 3 years. But despite that, it's been a privilege to be a part of it, to understand the landscape, to explore the issues, to ask the questions, to contemplate the potential solutions, and to make recommendations to government. It will be 3 years, 2 months, and 1 day when we hand our report to the Governor-General. What comes next? 3, 2, 1, go. Thank you.
Australia deserves a good defence force. We need someone to hold these people accountable. Currently, we're addressing the symptoms, we're not addressing the illness.
What are we doing? Every time another veteran dies, my son dies again. He's their brother, and he wanted every veteran to be okay.
It is the number one most important thing that we continue to revisit. What has come out of this, that we measure change, that we look at where funding is going, that we are flexible and we can create the gold standard.
This is one of those moments in times where we can really start to create change and measure it, which is fundamental for suicide prevention.
We need a change in language. We need a change in culture.
I'm hoping that out of this Royal Commission will come a sense of community urgency in addressing this national tragedy.
It's critical that the ESO community come together. We have a few issues to address. I'm certain that some of those issues will be identified and highlighted in the findings, and rightly so. The ESO community has wanted to do more for veterans, but at times is unsure of how to achieve those outcomes. If we remove the duplication and work closer together with other ESOs, I think we should stand shoulder to shoulder to then hold the government to account.
Commissioner Caldas has repeatedly reminded us of the number of reviews and inquiries that have taken place before this commission. I would like the commission to draw a line underneath all of that, and for us to acknowledge that this work has been done, that the recommendations will be made and handed down to government. I would then like us as a community to hold government to account.
Families, when my husband died, were something we still didn't talk about. Now, that was only 7 years ago. Now we talk about families all the time, and yet there is still resistance to support families. So one of the things that I really hope comes out of the Royal Commission is a true call to action to recognise and stop the resistance to supporting families.
I think the Royal Commission has made the problem abundantly clear to us now, and as a result we have to build a better system, not only for veterans today, but for veterans in the future.
Understanding why we were in the position we are and having to have a Royal Commission in the first place after so many reviews that have occurred, but hopefully this final commission is the one that draws the line in the sand and we get some forward movement.
Perpetrators and those who fail in their duty of care, whether it's inside Defence or inside the department, they must be held to account. Because to this day, that's been the common problem. The Royal Commission will be for naught if something permanent isn't put in place in the aftermath.
Ladies and gentlemen, Commissioner Nick Caldas, excuse me, is our final speaker today. He is going to make his final closing address as Chair of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. Would you please make welcome Commissioner Nick Caldas.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. I do want to start very briefly by just acknowledging all the dignitaries who are here today. It's very heartening to see you all here. I won't go through all the names again. You'll be happy. But I do also want to acknowledge the serving men and women and those who are former serving members of the ADF and their families. And much has been said today. I hope not to repeat too many issues, but there are some points that really bear repeating, and I shall try and be brief. The first point I want to make is about courage. The courage of those we lost, the courage of those who came forward and relived their pain and trauma to try and make sure it does not happen to anyone else. I have a cold, that's all it is, okay? That courage has made its mark and would remain with me personally forever. I often found myself wishing there was more I can do. I too have felt privileged to be tasked with participating in this inquiry and honoured to have led it. I want to thank all of the staff of the Royal Commission and all of those who toiled tirelessly, often invisibly, for the past 3 years. Your efforts cannot be in vain, and you should rest in the knowledge that you made a significant contribution to helping the men and women of the ADF, former and serving. We've done our best. I want to stress to those watching today that in our view, the majority of those who serve or have served in the ADF have had positive experiences, and that majority, when they left the ADF, have gone on to lead happy, productive lives after service. Excuse me. It is a fallacy to think that veterans are broken, but we must also recognise that there are unfortunately too many who have suffered and are traumatised, and too many who felt there was no way out and resorted to the extreme step. There are too many who suffered at the hands of bureaucracy, who paid the ultimate price, and it is for them this Royal Commission speaks and demands action. I want to acknowledge the large number of stakeholders who assisted the inquiry, some at great personal cost to themselves. We could not have achieved anything without you, and you too must take some comfort from the fact that you have played a major part in a historic moment in our nation's history that we all hope and pray will be the turning point for the welfare of our veterans and serving members. I particularly need to mention those witnesses and those who have made submissions from their own lived experience, the men and women of the ADF, serving and former, and their families and loved ones. Whether it was a written submission or you gave evidence in a public hearing or spoke to us in a private session, we shall never be able to thank you enough. I don't think I can express my views of the private sessions we held any better than what Commissioner Douglas has said. So many of the participants said, I simply want to be heard. Many said, I've waited 20 years for my story to be heard. I say to you today, we see you. We have heard you, and you have helped shape our thinking and views greatly. We three commissioners felt all along that this inquiry was at least a once-in-a-generation, possibly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be grasped by the government, the ADF, the DVA, excuse me, and the ex-service organisations to face the myriad issues we have brought into the light and then to deal with them. Or as Senator Lambie said to me, mate, there won't be another one in our lifetime. From unacceptable behaviour to sexual and other forms of abuse to the disciplinary system being weaponised against those who complain, to inadequate transition arrangements, to delays and unfair treatment in the DVA claims processes, all of these factors have led to the trauma experienced by thousands of people who have come forward to the Royal Commission. It's our view that the Royal Commission has indeed shone a light on the problems, bringing them into sunshine once and for all, putting them beyond debate or dispute. And this must be a call to action for our government and our government departments and the public. On ex-service organisations, I just want to say they play a key role, and our research has shown a much larger number than first thought. We're really grateful for the way they have engaged with the Royal Commission, and we hope that we have lit a spark that they will nurture, to unite, to embrace a peak body, and to collaborate and more effectively represent and serve their constituency. They have taken significant strides in the life of the Royal Commission, and we look forward to hearing of success in their efforts as they go forward. In relation to the DVA, we were heartened by and commend the government's response to our first interim report, in particular enacting on more adequate resourcing for DVA and harmonising the legislation, both of which are works in progress. But these early steps have indeed given us hope that DVA may be turning the corner, and there are many positive signs. We wish them every success on this crucial journey. As for the ADF, while many positive steps have been taken and some outstanding leaders have come before us, much has been promised. It's uncertain whether a critical mass has been reached in the leadership of those who concede the seriousness of the problems we have uncovered and are committed to acting to address those problems. Vigilance must be maintained, and no one should take their foot off the pedal in the reform process once the Royal Commission finishes. On the positive side, as I said, we've seen and acknowledged many examples of the courage and integrity that are the core beliefs of our Defence Force. We Commissioners have said many times that we're passionately supportive of the men and women who protect us, and also of our Defence Force. We want to see the ADF as a thriving, fulfilling workplace and an employer of choice. We recognise the pressure the ADF leadership is under to maintain retention, and indeed to grow the workforce in line with the Strategic Defence Review recommendations in this time of geopolitical instability. We again say the best way to achieve those goals is to recognise and admit that the problems exist and then fix them. Denial has never been a solution and would surely not help achieve the desired goals. We are cautiously optimistic. On a personal note, I have worn a uniform of different colour for some decades, and I've served in war zones as a police advisor and investigator, and I've felt the warmth of the tribe of colleagues, the team who care about you and support you through thick and thin. I know the gap in one's life that exiting from that tribe brings. That trauma is exacerbated when one feels the system has let you down. And decades of service have gone unrecognised by the manner in which you are treated in your hour of need. This has to change. As Commissioner Brown said, Deputy Prime Minister Miles said in his evidence that history will be the judge. He's absolutely correct, and that is why this government and future governments must take note of and accept the huge amount of evidence revealed during this Royal Commission. The fact that dozens of inquiries and hundreds of recommendations have preceded us with no significant effect is yet another pressing reason for action. The problems are now undeniable, and we urge members of our Parliament of all colours to deal with these issues in a bipartisan manner. Looking after our ADF members and veterans should not be a political issue. It must unanimously receive the support of our Parliament and our bureaucrats. And so we call on this government and succeeding governments to finally take the courageous step of overruling bureaucratic inertia and do what is needed, what is necessary and what is right. Our key recommendation: the establishment of an entity to monitor the welfare of personnel and report publicly and loudly will be crucial, not only to the implementation of our recommendations, but more importantly, to watch this space and inform the government and the public of problems and hopefully successes. We urge decision makers to consider this: the disestablishment of the Interim Commissioner's Office, that of Dr. Bernadette Boss, at the commencement of our Royal Commission has left a hole, a gaping hole. If our key recommendation is not accepted, we will in effect leave veterans in a worse place than where we found them. Our proud nation owes much to those who protect us. The men and women of the ADF have done all we ever asked them to do. They have worn the uniform, many have gone where angels fear to tread, and too many have paid a very dear price, up to the ultimate sacrifice. Recognising them twice a year, as has been mentioned today on Remembrance Day and Anzac Day, was never anywhere near enough. The public and the media have a role to play, and it is they who can compel governments to act. Having failed many over many years, our nation remains indebted to them, and the debt must now be paid. So in closing, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you. This will now conclude the proceedings of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veterans Suicides.
Thank you to our veterans, their families, the commissioners, thank you. The Commission staff, thank you. To our Chief of Defence, our Vice Chief of Defence, our service chiefs, thank you for coming today. For members of Parliament, thank you. For members of the public who've come today, thank you for coming. And for Auslan, to Nat and Rebecca, thank you. Patrick Lindsay, thank you. You'll be signing books, shining a light out in the auditorium, or out of the auditorium, where some lunch and light snacks will be served for the people here today. To those watching online, thank you for joining us. And a reminder, the report, September 9. Have a good afternoon. Lots to think about. It's been raw, real and emotional. Thank you for coming. Good afternoon.